Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. And today I have a very special guest on for the first time, Max Coleman. So if you aren't familiar with Max, he recently graduated from the Lehman College Master's Program under Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, the legend in hypertrophy research there. So that's awesome. Max's research pertains to the manipulation of training variables and their impact on muscle hypertrophy. So perfect for this podcast. So Max, appreciate you taking time out of your day to hop on here.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to chatting with you. And like I said off air, very novel topics for you that you probably haven't talked about before, Dropsets and Deloads. I'm just kidding. I'm sure you've probably heard of Max for those things. But yeah, looking forward to asking specific questions on it. But first, before I dive into that, I know you just recently graduated, so I'd love to hear your background. But I also have a question for you right off the bat. And that's, okay, so you're done with your master's. Is there any plans to continue on the academic side or anything like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the goal, I got into research around 19 or 20 years old. And the immediate goal once I got involved was, oh, I would like to be a professor. This is what I want to do for the rest of my life. So as soon as a PhD program opens up at Lehman, which hopefully happens in either the spring or fall of 2024, yeah, I absolutely plan on continuing to pursue further education in this area.
Awesome. Do you have an idea if it was a PhD, like kind of the route you'd go, or is that something that you develop as you get accepted and all that?
Meaning like which area of study
Yeah,
or
area
yeah,
study. Yeah.
so I just like to stick with what I've been doing. Like the without sounding overly ambitious, the goal is essentially to be Brad Schoenfeld, like to take in his, not to be as like, I don't think anyone's going to be the godfather of hypertrophy research, considering he's already the godfather of hypertrophy research. Basically, what I mean is that I don't want to be a Dr. I don't want to be Dr. Kandow, who much love to Dr. Kandow. He's an incredible researcher, but he basically just studies creatine for the most part.
I
And
see.
I'm
Yep.
really interested in and for instance, like there's other researchers who study very specific things with respect to hypertrophy or whatever it may be. But I really like not over specifying what I'm doing. So any resistance training variable that there is, I'm interested in, whether that be rest intervals, drop sets, deloads, muscle length training, whatever it is, that's what I want to continue studying. And I want to keep it as broad as I possibly can. Well, with respect to dissertation ideas, I have got nothing but ideas. There's a billion different things that I would be really interested in studying, but the field is growing so quickly right now that I'm going to wait a couple of years before I start thinking about dissertations, because now there's so many researchers studying this, so many, five maybe, but there's so many more than there used to be. So it's possible that anything that I'm interested in now might be discovered within the next 2 years before I actually start a PhD program. So not super sure, but there's a couple areas I'd like to go down for sure.
Yeah, no, that's what I was asking. I didn't know if you were going to be like super specific and you basically said, hey, I don't want to like niche down that much to where it's like I just study creatine or like I just study like fatigue and like hypertrophy or something like that. You want to keep it pretty broad there with that. And yeah, that makes sense too, that you don't want to pick a dissertation yet because like you said, something could come out in the next couple of years and it's like it kind of makes that not worth it at that point. So cool. If you don't mind, just briefly going over your background, how you got to, I guess, what got you into being interested in the research and whatnot there around this.
Yeah, so I started lifting when I was really young. I was about 12 years old. My dad, we had a home gym, and my dad liked to exercise at home, and that just looked really fun. And then I saw the Wolverine movie, and I was like, okay, that's the goal, right? So looking like Hugh Jackman and knowing that the gym was the way to get there. So just lifted, like, just because I enjoyed it and wanted to look like Hugh Jackman in the Wolverine, right? And then sometime around 18 or 19, Omar Isuf posted a YouTube video of Dr. Mike Israetel talking about the principles of hypertrophy training. And that was the first time I'd ever, excuse me, that was the first time I'd ever heard someone so eloquently talk about what you need to do to achieve hypertrophic adaptations. And hearing someone speak about it so clearly and so confidently with respect to the research that had been done on the topic made me realize, oh, this is the real path to the big T truth with respect to getting jacked. So that kind of led me down the evidence-based side. And that was just more so for a hobby, because I was actually a nursing major before I ever did any of this exercise science stuff, but it was still basically at the forefront of my attentional bandwidth constantly, right? So sometime around 20 years old, I ended up switching majors to exercise science. And within the first 30 seconds of my first lecture in that major, I was like, okay, yeah, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. So shout out PD Mumford, Mike Israetel, Omar Isuf, and my father for kind of leading me to where I am right now with respect to research. And then Chris Van was nice enough, and Dr. Roberts out of Auburn were nice enough to let me get involved in research there. And that kind of the way that research is carried in this realm is so different from the way research is carried out in something like chemistry or biology, where you're sitting in a lab by yourself toying with different genes on in rats or whatever it may be, right? The way that research is carried out here is a bunch of meatheads who wear glasses and lab coats and call themselves scientists, watching a bunch of people exercise and encouraging them to do more and more, right? It's really fun and really exciting. And basically from the first day that we did data collection at Auburn, I was like, okay, not only do I like this in a pragmatic sense, like I like knowing that I'm doing the right thing in the gym, but also just the carrying out data collection is fun in of itself. So that's what got me involved in research. So shout out all those people I just named because they're the reason that I'm able to talk about lifting on podcasts like this for fun.
Yeah, and that's a good point you bring up, how the research is a little bit different for exercise science. I also feel in nutrition too, I feel like it's just very challenging to do research in this field as well too, because of the fact that you can't just go use a rat or something like that. You do have to find people, and anybody who's coached anyone in the past knows how hard it can be. It's basically you're just coaching a bunch of people, I feel like, at that point. So it can be super challenging. Appreciate all the work you do there with that. So I guess while we're on the research side of things, so you said you were at Auburn for a little bit, correct? You studied, is that
Yeah,
where you got
absolutely.
your?
That was my alma mater, I suppose, is how they say it. That was where I got my bachelor's degree in kinesiology. Yep.
That's awesome. And Mike, is it Mike Roberts?
Yeah, Dr. Mike Roberts out of Doc, as his students call him. Excuse me, sorry. Yeah, Doc, as his students call him, Dr. Mike Roberts. He's an OG for sure. He's an incredible researcher.
I was going to say he's very into the hypertrophy research as well. And then he went under Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, another, like we said, the godfather of hypertrophy research. Definitely had some great mentors there with that. So I guess then my question to you, since you've been with Dr. Mike Roberts, Dr. Brad Schoenfeld, in the last couple of years, what do you feel have been maybe some breakthroughs from a hypertrophy research side of things? Or is there not anything as well from that standpoint?
Yeah, so no, there's definitely been some big findings in the last several years, and I think that we're going to continue to see that just in perpetuity for the rest of your and I lifetime, at least, because exercise science as a discipline didn't start until the 1960s. So if you compare that to something like biology or anatomy, which there's reason to believe that. I'm sorry, man. It's getting colder in New York, and I'm coming down with all the litany of diseases that this
Whatever it
petri
is.
dish of a city has. Yeah, but yeah, considering that anatomy and humans have been studying the human body theoretically since, I mean, there's cave paintings of people of hearts on people's chests, displaying that people at least had some sort of a rudimentary understanding of human anatomy, right? So we've been studying the human body and chemistry and stuff for hundreds and hundreds of years, and we've been studying exercise science for about 60 years, right? So I think that we're going to continue to see these incredible breakthroughs and different things within our field just because it's so new. And 60 years doesn't sound all that young, but in terms of science, in terms of scientific discipline, it's basically a 3-month-old baby, right? So things that have been found recently that I think are really interesting, for instance, like Milo Wolf, Dr. Milo Wolf, now doctor, no longer soon to be Dr. Milo Wolf, Dr. Milo Wolf, his range of motion meta-analysis and then all the work that he's done subsequently on range of motion and finding out that full ROM might not be, think about something as fundamental as range of motion, and the fact that we've been wrong about that for this long kind of gives you an idea of, oh wow, there's a lot of stones to be overturned. So I would say that is perhaps the most interesting thing to me that's been discovered in the last several years, is with respect to Milo Wolf's dissertation, which is to say there's something really special about long muscle length training. Rambled there, I apologize, but I would say that's definitely the biggest change of course that we've seen in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I'm and definitely like on podcasts and all over and social media, like you've heard a lot about that as well. So and it makes sense, right? Because I was the same way where I thought it was full range of motion, and then it's like now it's going back to maybe you don't necessarily always have to do full range of motion. And like you said, that is a very like big kind of cornerstone principle of training there that has been changed. I do have one follow up on that, just for somebody who is really into the hypertrophy research. There's again, I feel like this is picking up a lot of steam, this length and partials and length and work in particular. I think some of the kickback on it is, oh, it only works in beginners. Do you have any thoughts around that or anything like that? Is that something that has been shown in the research, or do you think that is maybe misinterpreted or anything like that?
The idea that length and partials only work in beginners.
Yeah, or it's just maybe something that's novel. It only works for like short term, where you really only see that response in the short term or as a beginner.
I'm really confused by the novelty argument. The beginner argument, there's something there, I suppose, but not really, in my opinion. I think that people will say, oh, they used untrained subjects in that study an argument against the study's findings, which it doesn't make a lot of sense, really. There are certain instances where using trained subjects would be better than using untrained subjects because of different adaptations that you see later in a training career. However, using untrained subjects can be really valuable when there's no difference in design. Like, for instance, length and partials versus full range of motion. I haven't heard a very strong rationale as to why using untrained subjects would be worse for answering the question of length and partials, right? There's no strong argument that I've heard for them responding better to length and partials than more well-trained individuals, if anything at all. The cool thing about using untrained subjects in studies is that the magnitude of difference that you'll see between groups is going to be much larger because the magnitude of response to training is going to be larger in general, right? So if you see a difference in untrained subjects and assuming that the research design isn't predicated on them being untrained, I wouldn't have any reason to believe that there would be a difference in trained subjects. Also, there are studies, and I could be wrong about this. I'm not the expert on this like Milo Wolf is, but there are studies that have done length and partial training in trained subjects. So I think that's a bad argument in of itself. And then the novelty thing, like I said, makes no sense because wouldn't it be equally as novel to do shortened partials? There's very
Yep.
few people in the gym. You go to the gym, most people are doing full range of motion training, just generally speaking, right? And there's a lot of studies comparing full range to shortened partials, which you don't often see people doing in the gym. And that would be a novel stimulus, right? But we're seeing much better growth in full range of motion compared to shortened partials. And we're seeing much better growth in lengthened partials than both full range and shortened partials. The novel one really makes no sense to me. And to be fair, usually when you hear arguments like novelty or untrained subjects or study length, like it was only 8 weeks long, generally speaking, that is someone coming at the argument from a point of bias, and they're
Yeah.
just using those three common critiques of research to support their biases, right? So I found this a lot with my like deload study, or actually the dropset study, either one. Oftentimes people will say that if we extended the study longer, we would see different results. And the interesting thing is that if regardless of which direction they go in, it's just their bias. So if they said, oh, if the Dropset study had gone longer, we would have seen that they would have stopped getting the results from Dropsets because they would get better at metabolite flushing because they'd have so like their fibers would shift to more slow twitch because of the amount of volume they're doing. Or conversely, oh, if we had kept doing the deload study, you would have actually ended up doing better because you just need more time to accrue fatigue. But that's just not found in other research that has been done on deloads that's also longer. I don't know, man. I think but all three of those arguments, like the untrained, the novelty, and the study length, are usually, not always, but usually used to discount studies without actually any good logical rationale for why they're trying to disprove those studies.
Like you said, there's like the bias aspect of it, and then you can be like, oh, it's not long enough, or oh, hey, it was because they were untrained, or whatever there on that. Yeah, that makes sense. It's easy to just nitpick that with everything. I was just curious to hear if you because I'm aware of the research, but I'm not like super engulfed in it to where I know like every like last detail of each study, and I just
So you
didn't
have
know
like
how.
friends and stuff, unlike
Yeah.
the majority of people in this field.
Yeah, and so I just didn't know like specifically how much was done on trained and trained subjects in those length and partials. Cool. Just go backwards just slightly here with this before we move forward with everything. What do you do for work now at this point? You recently graduated, waiting here on the PhD side of things. So do you coach or do you just look over research? What does that kind of look like?
I'm really lucky that I actually don't have to work anymore because Big Deload funded my study to make the findings that I did. So I get just to kick back on the grant that they wrote me for $6.3 trillion,
Yeah,
and I just get to
big
continue
deload.
putting out fake data for people. It's a really nice gig. No, so I graduated in May, yeah, and then just waiting for that PhD program. So obviously working while I'm doing that, and I have a couple of gigs now, and fortunately I'm in good with the people at Lehman, so I'm allowed to teach there. There's a couple of courses that
Cool.
I teach at Lehman, which is really nice. I'm still the lab technician at Lehman, so I still get to be involved in research there, which is really fun. And then I also make content and a podcast for Built with Science, which is an Instagram page and a YouTube page, I believe, and a TikTok, just content shit. It's Jeremy Ethiers or Etier. Jeremy Etier. I want it on the record. That's actually how you pronounce it. And us Americans always say Ethier, but it's Etier. So make content for him. And then also, yeah, coaching online as well as in-person private training in New York City. So if there's any listeners in New York City looking for a evidence-based trainer, I'm your guy. Hit me up.
Do you have a local gym there that you train at, or is it just or is like
There's a lot of private gyms in Manhattan, which is really nice. So there's a ton of, I don't know, shout out free market, whatever. We don't have to talk about that. But there's a ton of options for private gyms throughout Manhattan. And I also just got a job at the Live Method, which is a private training gym where people, if you're in that gym training, you're in there with a personal trainer and you sign up and they match you with a personal trainer and stuff like that. So there's a couple of different locations that I operate in.
Awesome. Yeah, it's probably not often you go into a gym and you get a personal trainer and he ends up being involved in a ton of research. So super cool that you're able to do that and stuff. And that's awesome that Big Deload paid for all that, man. That's fantastic. Sounds like that's where it's at. But yeah, no, that's awesome. So what about your training? What do you focus on your side of things? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I train exclusively for hypertrophy. I just want to be as jacked as humanly possible, right? And my training looks really weird now, is basically the easiest way of putting it. So I've in the last couple of years, just my relationship with training in general and the way that I go about training has changed quite a lot. And I've, like I said, I've been lifting since I was 12 and I'm 25. So I've been lifting for a larger portion of my life than I haven't been. So now I'm at the point where I'm trying to get I'm trying to eke out as much possible gain as I can, and I'm doing kind of some weird stuff to do that. So I'm training movement patterns that I would have never trained in the last 5 years. Basically, I'm trying to fill in the gaps. I'm doing movements and exercises and trying to hit muscles that generally get hit from compound movements, like things like your adductors and your hip flexors and stuff like that. But now trying to train with like almost a degree of hyper specificity, right? Where I'm doing hip flexion exercises and hip adduction exercises, right? Things like forearm curls and forearm extensions and what have you. So trying to just eke out the little, like trying to fill in. You're like with for the first 10 years I was painting with broad brushes, and now I'm trying to go in with a little bit finer of a tooth and then trying to eke out like whatever possible grams of muscle per year that I can grow. So I don't fall into a nice pretty full body push pull legs or anything like that. Like today I'm going to go to the gym and I'm going to hit abs, calves, hamstrings, chest, and forearms. So it's like a really weird split, but I really love it. And it's actually been really fun. I've started viewing it almost through a less optimal lens where I'm just trying to go and enjoy training. And I've actually noticed in the last several years that my physique has changed pretty drastically because I've stopped focusing on quote unquote optimality. Now, I still do, obviously. I'm still trying to do everything that I can to ensure that I'm going to grow, but I'm not worried about, oh my goodness, this exercise is not perfectly, the resistance curve of this exercise is not perfectly in line with the strength curve of this muscle. Like I'm doing something wrong, right? I'm just trying to go and lift and have as much fun as I can while I'm doing it.
Awesome. Yeah. And hey, at the end of the day, I feel like with hypertrophy, it really is. Can you laugh? Obviously, yes. Like you said, you want to optimize things. You want to make sure you're doing them correctly. Whatever you can do to keep you injury free and stay in the game long term is really where it's at from a hypertrophy standpoint. So that makes a ton of sense. So with your nutrition and stuff, do you focus on that as well too? Or you pair it up with, hey, try to be in a surplus, or do you not really worry about that? Or what does that kind of look like?
Yeah, so nutrition is less interesting to me. Still very interesting, but I'm a horrible dude to ask for nutritional advice because you guys have seen me. Like, if you watch any podcast I've ever done, shout out Starbucks, give me throw me some money. I basically drink these throughout the day as well as protein shakes, and then I'll have some meal at the end of the day. Like, I'm a horrible person to ask for diet advice for my own personal diet advice. Like, I know how to prescribe dietary interventions, but to ask me what my diet looks like, it would be like, yeah, that dude's not exactly the pinnacle of health. But yeah, so I do try and I do bulking and cutting cycles, right? I know that there's some research coming out, shout out Eric Helms and all the homies at Sprints, suggesting that maybe a caloric surplus is not necessary for muscle growth, right? But I enjoy the watching number get bigger, watching number, like my stupid Liz brain just enjoys watching things get bigger and get smaller. I enjoy going through cutting and bulking phases. I will say, a little interesting tidbit, this is probably the biggest mistake I ever made this is probably the largest mistake that I continued to make throughout my intermediate, more advanced years in training that held back progress was I would get really lean and then I would balloon up in 4 to 6 months to like
Yep.
basically like 25% body fat, 20 to 25% body fat. And then I would spend 4 to 6 months cutting and then I would go through that phase like over and over again, which is just a horrible way to go about building muscles. Now, what it looks like is I'll cut down to a reasonable body fat percentage. I won't try and get dick skin shredded, as they say, stage ready, but just somewhere comfortable and somewhere where it's not affecting my sleep or my personal life or anything. And then I will try my best, which is a much more difficult thing to do than it is to say, to very slowly increase my weight over the course of 8 to 10 to 12 months as opposed to 4 to 6. So yeah, just trying to gain weight really slowly and lose weight at a reasonable pace that doesn't result in kind of a ballooning back up. Now, with respect to macros, I don't give a shit about that at all. Like I make sure that I get my protein in, and then I let the hedonic side of eating take care of the fats and carbs. I often say to people, like, worry about getting your protein in. Like, first and foremost, worry that you're like, not worry, but focus on getting your protein in, and then track scale weight. But you don't have to step on the scale every day, but just to make sure that you're at least in the pointed in the general direction of your goals. Like, if you're trying to gain weight, make sure that you're gaining weight, but not too quickly. Somewhere around 1% a month is probably a really good idea. And then same with losing weight. Like, I'm someone who like really enjoys tracking, especially when I'm dieting, to know that like I'm my P's and Q's and I'm dotting my I's and crossing my T's and what have you. So I just try to make sure that I'm getting my protein in. And then when I'm dieting, I'll track a little bit more rigorously. When I'm bulking, I just make sure that I'm not gaining weight too quickly and let the carbs and fat do their own thing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Yeah, it's just making sure that weight's not like in this current phase, like you said there, just not like trending down, but also making sure it's not going up like too quickly either. Definitely a mistake I've made in the past as well too, is just really try to push that weight. People be like, oh, I'm going to get to this body weight and I'm going to get there in the next couple months. And it's, man, you're just probably going to be adding fat mass. It's not going to be all that muscle that you think it is. But yeah, no, that weight gain study I think was super cool. I actually just had Dr. Helms on the podcast yesterday and we touched on that. And yeah, some really interesting stuff there where, like we said, we don't really need to be in that big of surplus, which is nice, I think. And I think everybody's been there though. They've done that long or that big, massive surplus there where they gained a ton of weight, which I think can be helpful in some ways. But like you said, you do that over and over again, probably not super useful there.
Yeah, I know very few lifters who have not done a dreamer bulk at some point in their career where they ballooned up to even Eric Helms, like
He did, yeah.
the guy. Like he got fat as shit one time, and he'll like the pictures of him at that body weight don't even you like almost unrecognizable. And he'll tell you like, yeah, that was a big mistake that I made. And same with Alberto Nunez and a bunch of other people, including myself. Who you should not take the advice of compared to someone like an Alberto Nunez or Eric Helms, but I do at least agree with them that yeah, you probably shouldn't balloon up as quickly as you can.
Last question here on your training before we dive into your studies that you did. Have you incorporated any of the new like research, like again, length and partials? Again, Zach Robinson had the meta regression on training to failure, and then even now we had that in a study there with the volume cycling, increase in volume. Have you implemented any of those things or anything like that?
So in a way, yeah. So the like the partial ones, no question about it. Like I
Yeah.
do a lot of basically all of my work is either a lengthened partial or at the very least an exercise that has a resistance curve that makes the most stretched position the hardest. So it doesn't necessarily, so I call them pseudo lengthened partials, for instance. So if you look at something like a dumbbell pullover, that would be a pseudo lengthened partial where the hardest position by far is when my lat is the most stretched out and then it gets almost weightless right here. So I'll do stuff like that. Or another example would be like lateral raises, but cable lateral raises with the cable set at the height of your hand. So you can still train through a full range of motion, but the most difficult portion is going to be the most lengthened, right? So I definitely have incorporated that into my training almost entirely. Like maybe to the point where it's okay, relax, bro. Like you're doing the thing that you tell people not to do, and you're jumping the ship and getting ahead of what the research is actually saying. Because like I'm doing lengthen partials for like my chest and for like my hamstrings and stuff like that, muscles that have not been studied. So I'm like not hedging my bets, but maybe, but like I said, jumping the ship. So maybe I'm taking that one a little bit too far, but I'm just trying to experiment with it as much as I can. The nice thing about having lifted for so long is that muscle's really hard to build, but it's pretty hard to lose, assuming that you're doing the bare minimum of training. So I'm at least confident that I'm not going to lose any muscle. But with respect to like other things, like outside of length and partials, yeah, I'm a little bit more comfortable going closer to failure now. Like I for a long time, I was training at probably a consistent 2 to 3 RIR, and now I would like to think at least, but I'm sure that individuals in the gym will tell you otherwise. Like I try to stick around closer to 1 to 2 RIR probably. And then with respect to the Ean study, Like, I'm certainly not doing 52 sets a week for any of my muscles, but I am trying to, like, I've been doing specialization phases for quite some time now, and am trying to push that volume maybe a little bit harder than I would have in the past. The thing that sucks is that the research that's coming out basically says, yeah, you just got to make this shit suck as much as fucking possible.
Yeah.
You got to do a bunch of sets. You got to train to failure. Oh, and by the way, you got all of those sets. It's probably a good idea to make sure that they're in the most lengthened position, which is to say the most fucking painful position. So
Yep.
basically, every time I finish a set, I'm like, fuck you, Milo Wolf. This hurts so badly and it's basically your fault. So, yeah, my training has changed a little bit with respect to the research that's coming out, but nothing like crazily. No, it's not like I've done any 180s or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. Probably all stuff that you probably had an idea of. And now it's just, hey, it's out there. But like you said, again, the length and partial was the one there that was the big one that you've really focused on. Again, I think we pretty much knew that, hey, you probably want to make sure your sets are at least somewhat challenging if you want to build muscle, right? Like you don't want to be 10 reps away from failure every single time. So that kind of makes sense. And then I think the volume stuff too makes sense where it's like, again, you really just want to try to get in as much productive work as you can. Again, whether that's from you bring other muscle groups down in sets or again, you just make sure your recovery is on point, right? And just try to get as much productive work in as you can there with that.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I just had a podcast with Daniel Plotkin yesterday. We were talking about Daniel Plotkin's a researcher out of Auburn. He's incredible. You should definitely have him on your show if you haven't
Yeah.
already. But we were talking about things we've changed our mind on in the last several years. And we discussed that when you get to this stage of learning, so to speak, like when you're at higher levels of education and basically all you do is spend your time reading research and thinking about lifting, your mind doesn't change, so to speak. It's more so that the dial just gets turned for specific things. So like the dial was turned for volume. Okay, maybe we should start pushing things a little bit harder. The dial was turned for intensity too. So maybe we should start training a little closer to failure. I guess it's safe to say that there was a 180 with respect to full range of motion because now I'm doing mostly length and partials. And that was something that I just straight up changed my mind
Yep.
on. But yeah, and then same with like deloads. Like I still take periods away from the gym, but they are few and far between. I used to take breaks away. I used to take full weeks off the gym every 4 to 6 weeks, like full out of the gym. And I think that it probably didn't make a huge difference in my progress, but if you compound that over 3 years, that's a lot of time you're not spending in the gym that you could be theoretically. And so yeah, that's one that I've turned down as well. Like basically my deloads now look like, okay, I've been training for 10, 12 weeks. I'm 2 to 3 days into this week of lifting. So I've trained like 2 or 3 times and I'm feeling weird. I'm just going to take the rest of the week off and start a new cycle on the next Monday. It's what my deloads look like now.
Yeah, and I definitely say that your deload study definitely was something that changed my mind on them as well too, for the better. Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to diving into that specifically with you because I've had a couple guests on to talk about it. I've had Steve Hall on. I think I had somebody else to talk about it, but haven't actually had the person on who did the research. And I think it's always cool to be able to do that because there's some things that like I feel like we can read studies and we can interpret them and whatnot, but you're not actually like in the mind of the person that put it together. I think that's super cool. So let's dive into it. So you have two different studies. One, I think was meta-analysis. The Dropset was meta-analysis, I believe. I'll let you explain all that though. So I want to start with the Dropsets. So yeah, maybe just give a brief overview of why you want to do it. And maybe, yeah, I guess just a general overview of the study and then we can talk about the specifics and whatnot.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm not going to sit here and take full credit for it because the Dropset study was a class that I took at Lehman when I've talked about this ad nauseum. So I'll try and say I'll try not to repeat myself. But basically, the Dropset, it was a class where the whole class is just you're writing a meta analysis, right? Which is like the coolest fucking class on the planet.
Yeah.
So if you're interested in something like that, if you want your classes to look like that and sitting and jabbing with Mike Isertel for an hour each week about different philosophies of training, shout out Lehman College and come check us out. But yeah, so we put a bunch of ideas together and none of them were basically as good as Dr. Schoenfeld's, which was there's no Dropset meta-analysis, but there's a good bit of data on this. With a meta-analysis, all you're doing is you're compiling a bunch of different studies looking at a single thing that you may be interested in this particular instance, studies comparing Dropsets to traditional training, right? And for those of you who don't know, which I would be shocked if you were listening to a fitness podcast and didn't know what Dropsets were, but there's really no universal definition for Dropsets, both in the literature. So like if you ask two exercise scientists what a Dropset is, you'll probably get two different answers.
Yep.
And if you ask two bros what a Dropset is, you'll probably get two different answers, right? So there's really no universal definition, but I'll just throw out like a tacit one for the purposes of this conversation, right? Which is where you perform an exercise to close to failure or to failure, let's say a bicep curl, and then you reduce the load, so the weight that you're lifting, by around 10 to 20%, right? There's no, like I said, no universal way of going about doing this. And then you perform as many additional reps as you can, again, close to or to failure. And then you can continue dropping and continue doing drop more and more drop sets as you wish, but there's really no, again, universal guideline there. So you could do 3 drops, 4 drops, or just one single drop, right? As opposed to resting for 2 to 3 minutes in between sets. So we took a bunch of studies, 5 in this case, that were comparing drop sets to people doing to doing the same exercises but resting 2 to 3 minutes between each exercise, right? And we found that there was essentially no differences in hypertrophy or strength between any of these compiled all together. There was basically no differences whatsoever between hypertrophy and strength. There's a lot of caveats to that, which we can get into in just a second. But they did find that the individual in 2 of the 5 studies that we analyzed, they measured the time that it took them to finish each session that they were performing, and they found that they were taking less than half the amount of time that it was taking to do the entire, like, to do the same number, to get the same growth and more than double the time is a pretty interesting finding in my opinion. Threw a lot at you there, but we can break that down before talking about the caveats to the findings.
Yeah. So again, they basically just sum it up. You guys found that essentially it was no difference, and if anything, the drop sets save some time, which I think can be maybe like I think I don't know what you guys thought you would find going into it, but I feel like that might be counterintuitive to what some people would think of. Oh, I thought you needed to do all these straight sets, and that's going to be better because you're going to be able to use more load and whatnot. I think it's really cool that you were able to find that because again, it just shows that you do have some flexibility with training. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. If not, maybe we can go into some of those caveats that you were talking about.
Yeah, I definitely, when writing the paper, so this is showing my cards here, but generally speaking, I don't expect differences. It's just a silly joke to say I tend to agree with the null hypothesis, which is a joke that only virgins would understand, but is basically to say, generally speaking, I don't think we're going to find differences between groups when we're doing these studies at all, because these studies are generally 8 to, if you're lucky, 12 weeks long, right? And we're changing something pretty small. Like for this particular instance, just the rest intervals between sets. Technically, that's what a drop set is to a certain extent, right? Not exactly, and there's reasons for that, but it's essentially that, right? So I wouldn't expect, even when writing this, to see big differences between groups, right? However, while writing it, I went under the idea that it probably wouldn't work over time. If you extended these studies out, you probably wouldn't see similar growth. The individuals doing straight sets, you'd probably see them continue to grow more while the drop set group stopped growing as much. And I thought that because there are some individuals online talking about how your body gets really good at flushing metabolites if you continue exposing them to that style of training. There's really no evidence to believe that, in my personal opinion, or in actuality. So I think that even if you do extend the time that people are doing drop sets, I can't think of a reason why it would stop being effective, right? And one of those studies was actually 12 weeks long, right? 3 months of these individuals doing drop set style training, and they didn't see any reduction in the responses to growth, at least not compared to those doing straight sets. I did think that there was going to be I didn't think there was going to be a difference, but I did think at the time that if you extended it out, there would be a difference. And now I don't even think that anymore. I think there are some reasons why drop set training probably shouldn't be your sole way of training, but we can talk about that in a second if you'd like.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you what do you think are like the mechanisms behind that to where you are able to drop the load there on that and still see the same amount of muscle growth? Because again, the thought would be like, hey, you could just do that all the time. And I know you said you're going to hit on that. Yeah.
So I will not postulate as to what the mechanisms of actions are there because I'm not a physiologist. And also I think that oftentimes people will make an assumption about what the mechanism of action is as a result of studies of the results. No, sorry, let me rephrase. People will often try to propose a mechanism causing the findings that we see in pragmatic applied studies and vice versa, where we'll find something from a mechanistic study and someone will try to apply that to a pragmatic applied finding. So there was a lot of detraining studies there was a couple of detraining studies that showed like better shifts to type 2 fibers, more growth prone fibers, and rephosphorylation of mTOR pathways. And so that led people to think, oh, breaks away from the training, they resensitize you to growth, right? But even though that doesn't necessarily apply. And then conversely, you're seeing these lengthened partial studies come out, and people are like, "Oh, it has to be titin. Like it has to be titin. That it has to be the titin myofilament that's causing this stretch mediated response and causing some sort of additive growth at the distal end of a muscle, right? We have no fucking clue what's causing them, right? And it's impossible to take a mechanistic finding and apply it with 100% certainty to an applied finding, right? And vice versa. No freaking clue what's actually allowing for drop sets to grow the same amount of muscle as traditional sets. The interesting thing is it's counterintuitive to the rest interval research that we have. So that's what I was alluding to earlier. Like it is a rest interval study, but it's not at the same time, where we are drastically reducing. We're basically nullifying the rest times, where there's no rest time at all, and we're seeing same growth. But if you look at studies that are just shortening the rest time by a third from 3 minutes to 1 minute, you do see reduced growth, right? Now, the mechanism of action there, I'm not really sure of either. There's a reason to believe that it's more total tension, but that obviously is outweighed in the drop set literature because there's more total tension being applied to the muscle in traditional training than there is drop set training. Maybe there's some sort of increased metabolite sequestration or whatever it may be, right? Increased cell swelling that's leading to an increased inflammatory response, leading to more growth. This is all just to say I have no fucking clue what the mechanism of action is for drop sets. I literally no idea at all. Maybe it's just effective reps. Maybe it's just that you're getting more effective reps, more reps in that close proximity to failure in a shorter period of time. No clue. Literally no clue whatsoever. Long-winded answer. I apologize.
But yeah, no, that's perfect. And really what it sounds like, it's, hey, I wasn't looking for that. And you don't really need to worry about that. We're just looking for, because at the end of the day, most people, if they're going to incorporate drop set techniques, they're not really, why is this happening? They're just going to be like, hey, does it work or does it not work? Right.
Yeah, they're not like, I'm doing drop sets because it increases the hypoxic environment, right, which makes it harder for type 1 fibers to flush out metabolites. They're just doing it because some influence, like Jeff Nippard said, that it's probably not a bad idea.
So was there any, and again, so just so people know, like this was a meta-analysis, you guys looked at multiple studies here. Was was this a finding where you could, or could you figure out if it was everyone saw results, or was it again kind of person to person there? Or is that something that you aren't able to find out in a meta-analysis there? I'm sure if you went through the studies, you could probably find out, but
go ahead.
I was just going to say, was it something that worked in everyone, or was it on average, it just seemed to be the same? Or was there like some people that did drop set and it didn't work for them and other people it did and whatnot?
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. One, research is always based on averages, right? So I can say without even having seen the data that yes, absolutely, there are going to be some people in across these 5 studies that did drop sets and didn't respond at all. And there are going to be some people that did straight sets and didn't respond at all. There's going to be some people that did drop sets and doubled their muscle volume. Like the research is always based on averages, right? Which is what makes disseminate research to individuals very difficult, right? Because you're probably average, but we can't be 100% certain that you're average, right? Just based on averages and the law of averages, you're probably average, but we can't be sure, right? And then do we see individual data points when we're doing these studies? It depends on the study. This is why we're pushing for me, not really me, but like individuals like James Steele, Dr. Milo, and I am also pushing for it, but I'm not leading the revolution like these homies are, right? Like James Steele, Dr. Milo Wolf, Dr. Pack, who are pushing for open science, which is a framework in which we would be able to look at these individual data points, because you would basically, every single thing that we found from this study is now open to the masses, and you can run your own meta-analysis with different statistical models and see if you find something that is a little bit more meaningful or a little bit more applicable to a certain population, whatever it may be, right? So that's why open science is a really good thing for the exact question that you just asked, right? Because no, not all of the data sets from those 5 studies. In fact, I would imagine, so full disclosure, I wrote this like almost 2 years ago now, so it's not super fresh on my mind, but I don't think any of the 5 studies had individual data points that we were able to go through. Like none of them were done in an open science framework, right? So to answer your question though, the answer is yes. There were individuals who probably didn't respond very well, and there was probably individuals that responded very well, but on average, there just wasn't a difference between groups across all 5 studies.
And then I think one thing that I think of here for this too, was it, again, did they account for the intensity, or is it, again, that a potential like limitation of interpreting some of this data too? Do they have the intensity of the RAR that they used and whatnot?
So it depended on some studies were to failure no matter what, like regardless of which group you were in. And then some were volume matched, but in a really weird way of matching volume, where they would cut off the drop set group if they reached the same volume load as the other like contralateral arm in the straight sets. So generally, yes, it was mostly equated for intensity, but I think there was 1 or 2 studies where they tried to match volume load in a very strange way that would have precluded that intensity from an individual actually reaching failure. But again, I'm not super familiar on this, or like I probably should have read up on it. But it's all of that is to say that yes, intensity was generally accounted for, and throughout the majority of both of all of 5 studies, they were training to failure.
Okay.
Assuming that's what you meant by intensity.
Yes. Yep. 100%. I guess then I know you said there were some potential caveats here and like why you said you wouldn't necessarily have somebody always use drop set training. And then, so yeah, maybe that we'll start there with that. Sometimes I get ahead of myself here. So we'll go with that
Please,
first.
man, you've heard me ramble. It'd be silly for me to get onto you for that. Yeah, caveats are mostly to strength, right? There, we noted that there was really no difference between strength findings across all 5 studies, right? However, that's not misleading because we talk about this in the discussion, right? And it's, again, we have to base our results on averages. But the majority of the loads that were used in the straight set groups were like in that like generally 8 to 20-ish rep range, right? So things that we wouldn't expect to see much increases in 1RM strength, especially compared to another group that's also doing stuff in like kind of that 8 to 20 rep range. However, there are some caveats, and that is one of those being that there was one study by Ozaki et al. Where, golly, I hope it's Ozaki et al., where they were having individuals do either high load, low load, or drop set or bicep training. And they did see that those individuals that were doing high load training saw better strength adaptations than those in the drop set group. So that's one study where they were doing like something, I think it was like closer to 5s, and they saw better increases in larger increases in 1RM strength than those doing drop sets. And then there was also a study where they were doing tricep pushdowns, and I think this one was by Fink et al. And it was either Fink or Enos, which shout out Enos. He was also the big volume study that just came out. He also had one of the drop set studies that was in this meta analysis. So a great researcher. And they found that 12 RM tricep pushdown strength, either the Fink or Enos study, I'm not sure, was larger in the straight set group than the drop set group. But we weren't able to use that finding because we were looking for basic strength increases. So it had to be in like the 1 to 3 rep range. It couldn't be something like a 12 RM because it's a little bit more of like muscular endurance to a certain extent. I don't know. It gets murky when you start talking about like the specificity of strength, right? So on average, yes, drop sets and straight sets lead to the same strength increases. However, I think that might not necessarily be the case, assuming you are training with slightly heavier loads in your straight sets. And I think that one possible solution to this problem would be if you are interested in like increasing strength, and if you're a power builder, right? One possible and entirely theoretical science hat off, bro hat on solution to that problem would be just your first set that you do prior to dropping, make it a heavy set, make it a triple or like a 5, and then start reducing load a little bit more substantially than you normally would to put you in that 8 to 20-ish, 8 to 15-ish rep range for the subsequent drops that you do. But yeah, again, long-winded there.
So it sounds like the big thing was like if you're looking for strength, maybe not necessarily the greatest use of your time if strength is your main outcome. However, from a hypertrophy standpoint, are there any downsides you feel like from using drop set type training?
I don't know. So the reason this one's kind of difficult because if you ask, depending on the researcher you ask, like Dr. Mike Zordos did a mass review of this meta-analysis, and he talks about it way better than I do. So if you guys ever have questions reach out to Zordos, not me, and tell him that you're canceling your mass subscription. He'll email you back immediately. No, I'm joking. Shout out Dr. Zordos. He basically said that he doesn't think that drop set should be your primary form of training because you're more likely to go to failure more often, and there's a possibility of accruing more fatigue through that. I believe it's, again, been a while since I've read his review, but I think he said something along those lines. I would say I think that drop set training probably isn't a good idea because it's harder. It's almost harder to go to failure on drop sets. For some individuals, you'll see that they'll do a drop and they're like, look, man, I'm just tired and this hurts. I don't want to keep going, even though they theoretically could, right? So depending on the individual, these higher rep sets in general, because drop sets is another form of metabolite style training where you're doing something like it's pretty close to doing something in like the 20 to 30 rep range in general, right? And if you look at individuals doing sets in the 20 to 30 rep range, higher rep sets, the thing causing you to go to stop that exercise is rarely ever a true failure, like a true concentric muscle failure. It's usually, holy fuck, my arm, it feels like there's someone lighting a match inside of my bicep right now. What's going on? and it just hurts so much that I'm going to stop. So I said this on another podcast, but unless you have a group of research assistants standing behind you with stopwatches screaming at you to do more with the incentive of getting money if you do what you're supposed to do, it's unlikely that you're going to be going to failure consistently on drop sets. So it's probably, if you're one of these individuals, it's probably better to stick to straight sets in the more 5 to 10-ish rep range, just because you can be a little bit more confident that you're getting close to failure there. So that's my only caveat with respect to hypertrophy training, is that assuming you're someone who finds it difficult to go to failure, like true muscular failure when doing like higher rep sets, drop sets might not be a good idea for you. Now, the caveat to that, obviously, that there's some people that drop sets allow them to do these higher rep sets while also getting closer to failure. So me personally, I would say that I rarely fail in the 20 to 30 rep range because of, usually I'm failing because of pain or some
Right.
psychological torment that I'm putting myself through, right? Whereas drop sets, it's easier for me to go to failure because it's easier for me psychologically to know that I'm doing 10 reps and then 8 reps and then 6 reps. That just for some reason feels
Oh
less
yeah.
to me than 24 reps straight, right? I don't know. Just one. So hypertrophy, not much of a caveat there at all.
Yeah, so really it sounds like if you're somebody that you're okay with like pushing to that, and that kind of uncomfortableness for that short period of time can be something that's really useful for you, but you want to make sure you're doing that. So again, taking into consideration the person, the individual, which I feel like we do most of the time anyways, or what we want to do at least.
Yeah, if you're a good coach or trainer, like you're doing that anyway with your clients.
So it's like one of those things you kind of have to weigh the pros and cons. So you can get done in less time, but you have to make sure you are pushing yourself and be okay with some of that uncomfortableness
Yeah.
there
It's
with
like,
that.
would you rather go to prison for a year and sleep on a really soft bed, or prison for 3 months and sleep on a bed of nails? Like, it's going to
Which
suck either way, but for some people, they'd rather be in prison for less time.
just get it done. Cool. I guess what would be your practical applications here with I was gonna say myo reps, drop sets. Yeah. How would you implement it? Yeah. What does that kind of look like? Maybe how do you do it for clients and stuff like that? How often? Things like that.
Yeah, so I use it pretty sparingly. Like most of the time, I like to just keep stuff in the straight rep range, right? So I get to charge clients for longer, right? That's just joking.
Yep.
Yeah, I generally keep things in straight sets, but if I have an individual that's short on time, they can be really fun. And then it's just fun for novel's sake. Like, it's just fun to do it because it's new and
Yep.
it gives you this, as my friend Spencer Baldwin would put it, a skin splitting pump. Like, it really, the pumps from drop sets and other like intensity techniques like myo reps, like BFR training, whatever it may be, can just be really fun for the masochistic, like sadist like us that enjoy training pain for some reason. But the way that I actually, so this will be novel. Hey, I haven't said this on any podcast, but
All
the way
right.
that I generally use drop sets now is, as I guess this isn't novel at all, is it a burnout essentially? And when I say burnout, really a way of tacking in extra volume. So not doing the majority of my volume in a drop set, but just tacking on more at the end of a set or for an exercise of a session, whatever it may be, right? So like we have this data coming out that says it's probably a good idea to be doing more volume if you want to continue growing, right? To the point where we haven't even seen where that curve starts turning down. So what I normally do now is, okay, I want to get in 6 to 8 sets of quads in this workout. But if I'm sitting there on a leg press machine for 8 sets, I'm going to be miserable. So what I'll do is, okay, I'll do 4 straight sets, and then I'll do one really big drop where I'm doing like four normal sets, and then I'll rest my normal amount of time. And then this last fifth set that I'm going to do is actually going to be like a total of 4 or 5 sets so that I can tack on a bunch more effective reps, so to speak, or just a more volume in general in a shorter period of time, while also being pretty confident that I'm getting in the work that I need to from straight sets in case there's anything differential about the way that your body goes about responding to those two different stimuli. So that's how I generally go about it now, is a way of tacking on more volume in a shorter period of time, but rather not just all my volume in a shorter period of time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So a way to, like you said, if you want to get some more volume in, that can be a way to, again, to just like we talked about, save time and get that extra volume in. And also I think, like you said, not have to think about, oh crap, I have to rest for 2 more minutes and get another whole set in as well too. So it can be, from a mental standpoint, it can be helpful there. What about exercise selection? Is that something that you would consider here with this as well too? Or would
Yes,
it?
absolutely. And thank you, because you're basically keeping me in check right now. Yeah, absolutely. So don't be a dumbass, please. And don't be like, yo, Coleman at all said I should do drop sets with rounded back deadlifts, deficit rounded back deadlifts, or what have you. I think that we just choose exercises that are pragmatic, meaning like you can drop drop the load really quickly, unless you have two training partners with you, which given that it's possible that you do, but you don't want to be doing a lot of barbell stuff for two reasons. One, it takes you a long time to drop the load between sets to the point where like now you're just resting around 30 seconds, which we do know is probably not a good idea. And then it also, you have the possibility of like literally killing yourself because the bar crushes you while you're trying to eke out a lot, like your last two reps on the final drop, right? So your best bet is just pin loaded machines or dumbbells, essentially, both for safety and just pragmatic reasons of it's a lot faster, right? Aside from that, those two considerations are really all I care about with respect to exercise selection for drop sets. We talk about exercise selection more generally if you'd like, but with respect to drop sets, as long as it's something that is safe and you can drop the load very quickly, you're totally fine. Some will argue that it's probably better to do isolation based movements as opposed to compound movements, but whatever. I really think that's a consideration for me.
Is all yeah, as something like a leg press, you would do it on because again, it's not again the back squat aspect of it. You don't have to worry about the weight or bench or something like that.
Yeah, like a pin loaded leg press machine for sure,
Loaded, yeah,
which
right.
unless you're using the Atlantis pin load leg press, like you probably shouldn't be doing it anyway. I've never, so this is something I could talk about that just, I'll ramble a lot, man. I hope, yeah, sorry, we're not keeping this to an hour. I've never used a pin loaded leg press that was not absolute dog shit because they stop, and maybe it's just because I'm 6 feet tall, but they stop where my knee angle is like above 90 degrees, right? So
Yeah.
even, I don't know, that's just a rant that I want to go on. But yeah, so on like a pin loaded leg press, yeah, would be a good option if it's the Atlantis pin loaded leg.
And the regular leg press, you said that the downside would be if you don't have somebody to take it off, then you're resting a little bit longer potentially.
Yeah, and it's probably fine. I doubt that those 30 seconds that you're taking, because like the 30-second rest interval research that we have, they're using the same load, which ultimately results in less total reps and less total tension placed on the muscle without the benefit of potentially further metabolite sequestration or whatever it may be, right? So it's not a huge concern, but make it easier on yourself. Plus, you're having to get up and take a 45 off and then take the other 45 off. And it's probably not a big deal, but that's probably fatiguing you a little bit. It's maybe taking off 1 or 2 reps of leg press with like quad stimulation that you're going for theoretically when doing a leg press.
Yeah, and Dropset was something that I dropped. I just hadn't thought about doing it for a while because I switched more to like for intensity techniques, more like the rest pause myo reps. But my coach started programming them a little bit more in the last mesocycle, and it definitely felt more of it was that type of burn feeling that I haven't felt for a while in some exercise, and I definitely like it. I've been incorporating a little bit more with clients. What would you say? Would you say this is similar to rest pause myo rep style, or I know that obviously how you go about it's a little bit different, but would you say the thought process is the same on it, or yeah?
Yes, absolutely. Like I would imagine that almost all intensity techniques fall under the same category of it's just letting you do. It's metabolite style training. Like I hate to use that term, but that's basically what it is. You're just doing pump style training, burn
Yeah.
style training. Like it probably all is the exact same. And given that we have research looking at myo reps and research looking at drop sets and rest pause sets, and that they all basically say that they're equal to like straight traditional training, like then yeah, I would imagine they're probably like by the transitive property of getting jacked, like they're also probably just as effective as each other. I think that ultimately, sorry,
Very good.
it's basically like whatever lets you get close to failure. Like if you're someone who can get to failure just fine in 20 to 30 rep sets, like probably don't need to worry about doing intensity techniques. If you're someone who doesn't, and you also for some reason don't like drop sets, but myo reps are totally fine and you're able to get close to failure with those, use those. I think that's it's so lame. And we talk about this shit like it's rocket science and we use terms like metabolite sequestration, but bro, it's lifting. And the advice of bro, just lift is better than the advice of, yeah, your angular obligatories are actually not hit super well in the transverse plane because of the way that the myofibers interact with each other. Like just lift, and whatever lets you get closer to failure is probably a good idea.
Yeah, I agree. So really it's, hey, use whatever. Again, maybe it's something where you use one that you like for a little bit, and then you switch it up and you drop set, right? Because it is slightly different. And I think but again, at the end of the day, it is an intensity technique. And like you said, you just need to get close to failure, lift, and really that's it. So maybe something that you can cycle through as well too. Is there any like future research you'd like to see around this topic or anything like that?
I think that a study looking at what I was like talking about earlier with respect to strength and drop sets, so like doing something with maybe like a heavier load for your first set and then doing drops after that and seeing if that's similar to doing like strength style training. Because like most of the training that we looked at in those studies was not for the goal of increasing 1RM strength. It was just hypertrophy style training, right? So I think a study looking at that would be really cool. I think more studies maybe comparing drop sets to like higher rep training to see if there's, and then fiber specific hypertrophy would be cool too. Like looking at if there's for some reason, some sort of differential hypertrophy between fibers using traditional sets and intensity techniques of any kind, like drop sets. I think that would be really cool. But yeah, I would say, no, I don't have, it's not something that's at like the forefront of my brain or anything like that.
Yeah. Cool. All right, let's go to the second study here. This is one that I believe you did put together this one. This was not a meta-analysis, and it's a deload study. So curious to hear what made you want to do this, what you guys looked at, and then we can go dive into the specifics.
Yeah, so I can take a little bit more credit for this one
Okay.
than the Dropset paper, but I can never take full credit for anything that is done outside of the Lehman Applied Muscle Development Lab, patent pending, whatever TM, because it's a mad collaborative effort there. Shout out to all of the people, specifically Ryan Burke, who helped me carry out that study. Right, so I can take a little bit more credit, but still not full credit for carrying this out. But yeah, we can talk a little bit about I guess I'll start with why I wanted to do it, right?
Yep.
So for a very long time, people have been like quote unquote proselytizing all the benefits of deloads, right? Using those mechanistic rationales for what I was discussing earlier, right? There's some studies to suggest that people taking shorter periods away from the gym will lead to like some markers of decreased fatigue, like more favorable testosterone to cortisol ratios, as another example, right? But there was very little like actual applied research on the topic. So there's all these coaches talking about how it's amazing, all these influencers on Instagram talking about how it's amazing, but very little research, right? In fact, there was an interview study done by David Nolan and Dr. Lee Bell and Dr. Pack outside of, or soon to be Dr. Lee Bell, sorry, and Dr. Pack out of Sheffield Hallam University in England, where they were interviewing. I think it was like somewhere around 24 coaches, and these were like big boy coaches, like big boy, big girl coaches in the field. So I don't think I'm supposed to say any names, but just people that were like you would know these people that they were interviewed, and basically every single one of them used deloads, whether it be for strength or hypertrophy, right? So not only are these influencers talking about how it's really beneficial, and clearly it's used very commonly amongst high level coaches in strength and physique sport, but there's very little direct research looking at deloads, right? So that kind of presented itself as a huge gap in the literature, right, for the purpose of a deload study, right? And we had two deload-ish studies out of Japan. So these were done by Ogasawara et al., where they had individuals, untrained subjects, doing like either continuous training for the entirety of either 3 or 6 months, because one study was 3 months, one study was 6 months. And then another group that would train for 6 weeks, take 3 weeks off, train for 6 more weeks, 3 weeks off, blah, 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 right? And they found basically no differences between groups, either in size or strength, statistically significant findings, which is a whole can of worms we can get into. However, they did trend towards continuous training being better for both strength and hypertrophy. So they grew a little bit more towards the end of the study and they had larger strength increases. They just didn't reach statistical significance in either study, right? So there's that just adds a little bit of pause to the idea that these things are really beneficial, but it wasn't perfect because these are 3 week detraining periods. So one, they were just detraining entirely, and then two, it was 3 weeks. Three, they were all untrained subjects with relatively low sample sizes, and they were only training the bench press. So not very ecologically valid at all. Very good for internal validity, where it's like, okay, we can be very sure that blah blah blah, this is causing this, but no one's really training like that, so it's not like it can apply to us in any way, right? So we wanted to make something that was a little bit more realistic to how deloads are actually done. So we created like a very simple design for that. So that was the drive for why we wanted to do the study. We can break that down a little bit, or we can start talking about how we actually went about studying this.
Yeah, I think I would like to go into like how and everything, but what was your thought going into it? What did you think? Maybe you just answered that too. What did you think was going to be the finding? Because like you now with this type of research, do you have to have a hype? What would they call it? Where you're is
Yeah,
it a hypothesis?
hypothesis.
Yeah.
And it depends on the journal. Some require you to propose some sort of hypothesis, some don't. Generally, I'm pretty anti hypothesis. I don't think, what's the point?
Yeah.
Who gives a shit what I think
What do you
before
think?
we
Yeah.
do the study? I just want to see what the results are anyway, right? There's a question. I want to know the answer. Who gives a shit what I think the answer is going to be?
Yeah.
But with respect to that, I think in the paper, so this is horrible. I guess I'm, again, putting my cards on the table here. I didn't really think there was going to be, in the paper, I wrote that we think that there will be better benefits to blah blah blah, the ones taking periods away because of X, Y, and Z rationale. But realistically, I didn't think we were going to see a difference in hypertrophy at all. I was like, whatever. It's literally 4 less workouts over the course of 9 weeks. We really think there's going to be a big difference between. Do we think these people are going to be building a pound extra of muscle because they trained or didn't train for 4 workouts? But with respect to strength, I did expect to see a difference. I expected the group that took a deload to improve strength gains more than those that didn't, that trained continuously, right? And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, low days and fatigue management in general, like deload periods, tapers, are very popular in strength sport, even more so than physique sport. And there's also just reason to believe that if you can minimize fatigue as much as possible, that's just better for strength expression in general. Hence, taper. There's a lot of taper literature to suggest, though, tapers are clearly good for performance, right? So I expected strength to have some sort of a benefit, and I didn't really expect a difference in hypertrophy at all. And spoiler alert, we didn't see a difference in hypertrophy at all, but strength was actually much worse in those that took a deload as opposed to those that were training continuously.
Yeah. And with the study, the big thing is you wanted to see what it would be like with a more traditional setup versus like in the other ones that, like you said, there was extended periods of time off, which you wouldn't typically see somebody do. Nobody's, oh, I took I'm going to take a 3 week deload. It's going to be, like you said, a week or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's what you
Or
guys
like if someone's taking 3 weeks off, it's not usually someone being like, yeah, I'm taking a 3 week
right.
planned deload for resensitization. It's someone like, oh, I hurt my foot, or I've got a busy week with my kids at school, like a busy month with my kids at school or vacation or whatever it may be. So it is realistic, but not for people who care way too much about this stuff.
And so you gave away, hey, you looked at strength hypertrophy. You did find no difference in hypertrophy. Strength was off a little bit. I don't know if you hit on like kind of the setup. I think you said it was 9 weeks. And so 9 weeks straight through. And then the other group was 4 weeks deload, 4 weeks on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I'll go through how we actually went about answering these questions, right? So we had 2 groups, right? One that trained continuously for 9 weeks, one that trained for 4 weeks, took 1 week, not a deload per se, but 1 week completely off of training, right? A true detraining period, and then 4 more weeks afterwards. And before and after the study, we measured a bunch of things: muscle thickness, body composition, isometric and dynamic strength. So isometric strength on this big fancy $60,000 sex torture looking machine called the Biodex dynamometer, and dynamic strength on the 1RM Smith machine squat. We also tested like muscular endurance and counter movement jump, like power production, right? But that was pre and post, right? We also measured one other thing after the 4th week of training and after the 9th week of training, right? So 24 to 48 hours after the last session of their 4th week and the last session of their 9th week, we imposed a ready to train questionnaire, right? Which is this 7 or 8 question questionnaire, basically just going through and asking your athletes questions that you would normally ask your clients after a block of training, right? How'd you sleep last night? What's your appetite looking like? How strong do you feel today, physically and mentally? Blah, blah, blah. How sore are you? And we already touched on the other findings, right? But the most interesting thing to me was that the individuals that took a detraining period, that deload, they actually saw increased muscle soreness at the end of the study and a decrease in motivation to train at the end of the study, whereas those that trained continuously were less sore and their motivation to train did not waver for the entire study. So I thought that was super cool because deloads to me have always been a psychological thing. Yeah, the physiological rationale is there, but again, do I really think that taking a week off is going to lead to drastic changes in your physiology that make you respond better to training? Probably not. But I do think that it's really beneficial for a lot of people to take that break away. And my study, again, one study, so it's not deloads are bad, never do it again, right? And I have caveats to this as well. It was just really interesting to me that the findings from my study but challenged my idea that deloads were good for a psychological reason more so than a physiological one.
The soreness kind of makes sense from that standpoint, but
I'm gonna grab a water. That's
go
all right.
ahead.
I'll be over.
Yep.
But
Yep.
you go. I'm listening.
Yep. But the mental side of things, I think, is pretty interesting there. That would definitely be something that I would have thought would have been flipped on that. Okay, so we went over what you guys found, and again, you basically from a physiological standpoint, hypertrophy was the same, strength was a little bit lower, and so I guess one of the things here is that from my understanding of it that you need to pay attention to was, hey, you guys had them take an entire week off. Was that just to make it standard there with that? Because again, the way people deload is all over the place, so I just didn't know if that was just a way to standardize that. I'm assuming.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's somewhat of a proof of concept study, right?
Yeah.
To us because it's the first of its kind. So we wanted to make it as simple of a design as possible. That's what I was alluding to earlier. But also, given that if we were going to see differences, like we wanted to make it as drastic as possible. So like the likelihood of seeing differences with a detraining period is more likely than the likelihood of seeing differences because already we're not changing much, right? 2 less workouts, 4 less workouts. Like if we were just took those and then made it 2 or 4 lesser workouts, rather meaning like they were just training with half the volume or intensity or whatever it may be, like even less likely to see a difference, right? Now with that, at the same time, a lot of people argue that's not ecologically valid, which big fancy word that just means that doesn't apply to the real world. No one actually takes a full week away from training. And yeah, bro, look, Instagram user 1342. I agree that most people like you and me don't just take full weeks away, but the average
People
person who
do.
goes to the gym, it is very common for them
Yep.
to deload via a vacation or a busy week at work where they're just not training at all, right? So I think that it lends itself well to that side of ecological validity as well, right? And also, the last thing I'll say here is that the definition for deload did not exist in the
Yeah.
literature when we started this paper. There was no universal way by which we knew how to deload. Like we didn't just say, okay, just take half the volume or just do half the intensity. And fortunately, while this study was being carried out, another study was also being carried out, a second round of this deload study by David Nolan and Lee Bell and Dr. Pack. And I was actually fortunate enough to be involved in this one as well, where it was a survey study where we were trying to come up with a definition of deloads. And we were like we created a list of questions that we sent out to a bunch of high level coaches and just had them answer based on their feelings of deloads, their response to deloads and stuff like that. And we ended up boiling it down to, and I'm going to botch this, I'm sure, a period of reduced training volume or intensity with the goal of increasing muscular adaptations and following training cycles. I'm sure that's not exactly it, but it's close enough, right? And so if you look at that definition, even now that we do have a definition for deloads, that reduction in training volume and or intensity is not defined, meaning detraining is still technically a deload period, given that it is a reduction in training volume and or intensity to zero, obviously, with the goal of increasing adaptations in future training cycles, right? A lot of people say this isn't a deload study, it's a detraining study. And like, how can you say that if we don't even have a definition for deload? And now we do have a definition for deload in which detraining falls under. So I think that arguing that this isn't a deload study is a bit silly, right? And a bit semantic.
You make a good point too that yeah, obviously somebody who's super advanced, like they probably don't take a week off, but a lot of people do end up actually doing that. That is actually a good kind of thought behind that. And I know that you said this earlier, like you don't think the time, because again, I think I'm sure somebody would say, hey, 9 weeks. What if this was 6 months or something like that? And I know you hit on that initially. Do you think, and I know you, again, I think you said this earlier, but do you think that would change anything here with the findings at all? Or do you feel pretty confident that, again, the time wasn't necessarily an issue?
Okay. One, we don't really have to pontificate as to what would happen if this went on longer because we have those Ogasawara studies that were much longer. Again,
Right.
not perfect studies, but they were done over 6 months, which is fucking unheard of in this field. And they found no statistically significant differences, but it did point in the direction of taking periods away from the gym was a little bit worse for gains, right? So they were doing like 75% of the total training volume as the continuous training group in those Ogasawara studies, and they barely saw any differences, right? Now, anytime someone says if you extended this study longer, they either say, yeah, you would still see no differences, or you would see, or it would just go in either direction. They'd be like, oh, that's way more training away from the gym. They're not going to grow nearly as much. Or, oh, that's way more fatigue reduction. They're going to grow way more because of it. It's whichever opinion they have
Yeah.
on deloads is what
Right.
their answer is with respect to that. For me, I do think that if we extended this study on for a very long period of time, like a training career, for instance, if you're taking every 4 weeks a full week out of the gym, it's probably not a good idea. That's, I don't know, my math is going to be horrible, but 12 weeks or so, like 10 to 12 weeks out of the year that you are not training as opposed to continuously training. And I think that I can speak anecdotally. So again, researcher hat off, my bro, I lift hat on. I've noticed that those weeks that I would take out of the gym over the last 3 years and in the last year or two that I haven't been doing that, I've noticed some pretty substantial differences in my responses to training because of, and there's other variables I'm changing as well, which is why we have research because you shouldn't take my advice on this because that's not the only variable I changed. But I do think that if you extended the study for long, like a much longer period of time, it's probably better to not take extended periods away from the gyms very regularly but it's probably not going to hurt you if you do significantly, right? It's not going to make a huge difference in your physique at the end of a training career if you take deloads a little bit more regularly than you probably should.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Just I thought this study was good in that, again, you could take it if you need it, but again, you probably don't want to overdo it as well too. And we can talk about how you apply this now to your training and stuff. But two questions real quick on the findings. So skill part, the strength side of things, do you think that was a skill thing there with that where they took that week off, or what were your thoughts on that? And then if you want to briefly touch on like why you think maybe from a mental standpoint the people that took the deload were showed a little bit more mental fatigue.
Yeah, so I think that there is something to say about skill acquisition and the fact that you're taking a week away from practicing something, but then you get 4 more weeks to practice it. It
True.
makes it seem like it's unlikely that would be the reason that they saw a detriment. However, so this is the most convincing argument I've heard and made for myself. I guess maybe someone else has said this also, but to me, I think the reason that they saw deloads as negative is because these were normal people with friends and families and lives outside of lifting who don't even know what a deload is. Go ask your grandma after this podcast what a deload is, bro. And she'll be like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, no clue. Like, my parents, same way. Like, I wrote a study on deloads. I bet if I ask my mom what a deload is, she has no idea what I'm talking about, right? Shout out you, mom. I'm sure you do. I love you. But I think that the reason that they saw they had a negative opinion about these deloads is because they were normal people who love training on average, and they trained for 4 weeks straight. They were making great progress, and then we were like, okay, take a week off. And instead of thinking of Mike Israetel saying that it's going to lead to better growth after that period, all they're thinking is, oh shit, I'm taking a week away from training. I'm about to lose all my gains, right?
Yeah.
It's probably the more common belief that was held by the majority of individuals in my study, right? Also, generally speaking, when you do a deload, at least assuming you adhere to the majority of the way that people do them in the evidence-based field, is that you take a deload and then you have a week where you're getting back into the flow of things, right? You're starting with slightly lower volumes than you may have finished with before your deload, right? However, what we did was we threw them right back in the fucking swing of things where they were doing it was like 20 sets of quads and 20 sets of calves a week, and then 10 sets for each upper body movement as well, right? Each upper body musculature as well. So I think that there might be something there with respect to, we told these individuals take a week off. They probably didn't think that was a good idea. And then they came back and we threw them right back in the swing of things of 20 sets to absolute all out failure on Smith machine squats and leg extensions and calf raises. I personally would come back feeling really lethargic. And that's what the majority of the subjects said. They came back from that week off and they were like, yeah, I'm fucking tired. Like, I don't really like, they felt slow,
Yeah.
like on average, right? And which makes sense. Like, they'd been detrained for a week and they were coming back to a really intense hardcore workout without any graded exposure to that. So I think that's at least one reason why it was viewed as like a negative by those that were in the dealer group. Had there been a bunch of Jeffs and Maxes and Mike Israetels and Steve Halls in the study, like actual lifters, like meaning they were actual lifters, don't get me wrong. The average training experience in the study was 4 years, but people who are entrenched in evidence-based fitness, they probably would have had a different outlook on the way that deloads affected them throughout the course. They probably would have had a more positive view. And I would imagine, and this is complete guessing on my part, right? Conjecture. But I would imagine they would come back being like, yeah, I feel refreshed and ready to go. I'm all resynthesized for growth, right? As opposed to, I just took a week off and lost all of my gains, right? So I think that's just one possible explanation.
Yeah, that makes sense. Keeping that momentum going, and then maybe like partly too, just somebody that's not super into training. It's nice to not have to work out. Now I got to get back into it again. This is as well too with that. So that makes sense. Cool. And then the skill part makes sense. When before I hopped on here with you, I was like, okay, that makes sense. Maybe they lost some skill, but at the same time, like you said, they did have 4 weeks in the groove there. So I guess then to finish up the talk on this two-parter here, was there any other like misapplications that you saw of this study? And then what would be your kind of like practical applications here for the study?
Misapplications, I don't know. I can't say. I guess Menno Henselman made a post like deloads are worthless. And Menno's been on that for a while. And I do lean towards his ideology with respect to deloads. Like, yeah, bro, because there's a new full moon does not mean that you need to take a break away from the gym. Like, agree with him there. But to say that there's just no context, and he's not saying this by any means, but to say that, again, Menno Henselman did not say this, but to say that there's no benefit to deloads whatsoever is obviously silly. There's a lot of like really high level athletes who use them, and success leaves clues, bro. I'm not saying that by any means, but there's probably something to taking breaks away from the gym every once in a while, right?
Yeah.
Whether it be physiological or psychological, there seems to be some sort of a benefit, right? So in this applications, I can't say much there because most people were, I would say most people that are in the evidence-based side were probably doing more auto-regulatory deloads anyway, where they weren't just saying, okay, it's been 4 weeks, let's deloads. They were saying, okay, it's been 4 weeks, how do you feel? Do you feel like you need a deload? No? Okay, let's keep going. Yes, all right, we'll give you a week off. So I would say that there probably hasn't been a huge swing or anything like that with respect to how people go about implementing these deloads. But I would say that I really hope no one reads the study and thinks, okay, there's no reason to deload ever, and there's no benefit to taking a break away from the gym, because that's probably not true either.
Yeah, for me personally, like you said, being using that auto regulated approach to deloads is, I think, super. Like that's something that when I first started coaching, it was like, oh hey, every 4 weeks, right? We're gonna deload, and then now it's okay. I already start to lean towards more. If you don't really need it, why do we do it? And then this study just solidified that, where it's, hey, we probably can push this out a little bit longer for each training cycle than initially thought. And so I think this just brought light to that. Cool. Is there anything else on this study that you want to go over
There was
that
a
we missed?
two-parter question that you asked, and I think I only answered the first part. What was the second part of the question?
Just practical applications of it, which I feel like you went into. But if there is anything else from the practical application side of things, I'd love
Yeah,
to hear that.
yeah. So basically, it's what I said. If your athlete tells you that they need a break, give it to them, because there's very clear evidence that taking a short period away from the gym is not going to make your muscle fall off your body. And then conversely, if you have someone that feels really good, but they've been training straight for 8 weeks, don't force them to take a deload because you think
Yeah.
it's going to lead to some sort of better growth, right? And with respect to how to go about implementing deloads, like the actual deload paradigm to use, no fucking clue. Like no clue as to what's the best bet, right? The way, so I started thinking differently about deloads prior to my actual data collection. So I wrote my narrative review for deloads, right? Just to get ready for the actual study itself so that I could become like a content expert before actually studying the thing myself and writing up a research design. But I started thinking about it differently because even towards the end of that week that I would usually take off, I'd be like, dude, like I feel good after Wednesday. Like I'm ready to
Yeah.
get back to the gym. I'm not only do I like I'm antsy to get back to the gym, but like I just feel fine. And like I don't think I need these extra 4 days. So the way I generally, I think, I don't remember if I said that. I said this earlier in the podcast, but I'll just reiterate. The way I generally go about deloads now is I'll train for as long as my body will let me, and generally that's like close to 12 weeks now. Anywhere from 8 to 12 weeks is usually how long I'll go. And then I'll start feeling exercises in areas that I shouldn't. So I'll be doing bent over rows for let's say 6 weeks, and they'll feel really good. I'll get a dope erector pump. I'll feel it like really well in all of the back musculature, my lats, my rhomboids, whatever, my traps. And then 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks go by, and I'm like, okay, I feel this more in my lumbar spine than my erectors. I feel this more in my rotator cuff than my traps. Maybe it's time to either replace this or just take a short little break away from the gym. So usually what I'll do is I'll train on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, because I usually like to train 6 days a week. And then I'll just take the second half of the week off. Just Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. I'm not doing jack shit. Those periods are really nice because it lets me to like really focus on work, because that's 1 to 2 hours a day extra that I have.
Yeah.
So I just, yeah, like the very auto regulated, very non-scientific, very non-evidence based, tracking each and every little variable that I'm doing, very just listening to my own body and kind of being an intuitive with it. And I think that's a good way for coaches to go about it too. If your client comes to you, ask for your deload, give it to them. Who cares? If not, don't force them to take one because you think it's going to lead to better growth. So that's all
Yeah.
I'll say on that.
Yeah, and like you said, it doesn't. You also don't have to fall into that constraint of, oh, it has to be in a week either, right? There's no magic to that
Yeah,
week. It's
yeah.
just
A lot of
like,
people like the Judeo-Christian Monday through Sunday
yeah,
like time period. So I always tell my clients, like, don't worry about the perfect Monday. Like we can start on a Wednesday, but even
yeah,
myself, I'm like, who the fuck is starting a cycle on a Wednesday? Like I'm waiting till the next
yeah,
Monday. So it doesn't
yeah.
have to be a week, but people do tend to like to start things on Monday and end them on Sunday.
Yeah, no, that is so true. It's we sit here and say, oh, it doesn't matter, but then it's still, wait a minute, am I really going to start this on a Wednesday? Like I got to wait till
Exactly.
Monday to get this going. Awesome, man. I guess real quick before I let you go, anything coming out on your end? Any like research or anything like that coming out soon or anything like that on your
Yeah,
end?
absolutely. So not my end specifically, but I'm just lucky enough to have my hand
Yeah.
dipped in a couple of different camps here. So there was a recent study that we just wrapped at the Lehman AMDL lab where we were looking at differential hypertrophic responses to different exercises. So like leg extension for rec fem versus leg press for vast
Awesome.
thigh muscles, right? Seated calf raise for soleus versus standing calf raise for gastroc. So I'm not going to talk about the findings just yet, but that's a really cool one, like a really
Yeah.
cool one that's coming out now. There's also that technique study that Dr. Pack was nice enough to let me on that just came out, looking at all the research that we have with respect to technique. Is there really such thing as good or bad form? So that's a really cool study. And then next semester, so next spring, at 25, you really shouldn't be referring to time periods as semesters anymore.
Semesters.
It's a little
Yep.
embarrassing. Right? But next year for the spring, Ryan Burke, shout out, is carrying out a superset study that's going to be, I think the findings from that are going to be really cool too. So,
Awesome.
like I said earlier, we're in the infancy, and there's just for the next, God, 20 years, probably there's going to be constantly new research coming out that's really cool and interesting. Yeah. So there's a lot to stay on top of and a lot of cool stuff coming out here soon.
Awesome. Yeah. And I feel like the superset will fall into that like time saving technique aspect. So just another tool in the toolbox there.
Yep.
Yep. Awesome, Max. We'll appreciate your time. We'll have to get you back on here in the future, talk about any more research and whatnot. So again, appreciate your time. I guess lastly, before I let you go, anywhere where you want to lead the audience to find you or anything like that.
Yeah. So you can find me on Instagram. It's basically the only social media app I use anymore. At Coleman et al. So Coleman.et.al. And then for the real nerds out there, you can find me on ResearchGate, and that's just Max Coleman, and I'll come straight up. But yeah, aside from that, I'm all good. And as always, man, thank you so much for having me. This was a ton of fun to talk about this shit.
Yep, and it flew by too. So anytime I have any hypertrophy researchers on, I feel like time just flies by. And man, I think we could have made it to another 6 hours potentially there. But yeah, Max, appreciate your time, and we'll chat with you soon.
Awesome, man.